So everyone, welcome back. This is part 2 of our class on obedience, and we are looking at a slide right now that gives us an image of a famous image, in fact, of a man challenging tanks on Chang'an Avenue in Beijing, June 5th, 1989, which of course is the occasion of the famous Tiananmen Square demonstrations, where this kind of effect that we've just been talking about, we were just talking about the Kent State shootings and how when the people feel that too much force has been used, that excessive force has been used in the government's relationship with them, that perhaps the people can respond and rise up, And I think the revolution in China is, of course, at that time was a very instrumental thing, but of course it was connected to a wave of revolutions that were going on throughout the communist world in 1989 as the Berlin Wall was falling and various other things were going on in the former Soviet bloc. So when people refuse to obey, as we can see in the image, oftentimes those revolutions can be put down dramatically. Similarly, if the government doesn't toe the line in terms of norms and standards of government behavior, then the people can rise up. And so I think these two dynamics are in motion when we talk about revolutions. One person who's commented a lot on revolutions is Theda Skocpol, and she argues that revolutions importantly tend to be sort of contradictory in the long run. They can change a lot of things, revolutions, but as we were sort of implying before, once you have a revolution, you tend to have a reaction or a counter-revolution, and the revolution can sort of consume itself. One of the things Theda Skocpol is interesting in studying is how even though you can go from being a democratic country in a revolution to, say, being a communist country or vice versa, that one of the things that we can see in revolutions is that they tend to leave the state strengthened as an institution overall. That is to say, even though the new party coming to power might have a totally different ideology, once they've had their revolt, they tend to be very worried about counter-revolution. They tend to be very worried about the old forces coming back. And so one of the things they do is they securitize themselves. And in securitizing the society, they can actually, oddly, even though they were themselves fighting for, say, more democracy or more freedom, the logic of state power, the logic of state security tends to hijack the revolution, and they end up with less democracy than they had before. So that's a bit of a problem for us. Another thing that we can talk about in terms of revolution is the way that we've just covered this idea of how revolutions can kind of devour themselves or eat themselves in terms of their values and commitments, but that doesn't always happen, and sometimes the revolution can actually have hugely concrete effects that will produce a democratic outcome. So Theda Skocpol isn't right that it always ends up a certain way or in tragedy. And I think a classic example of revolution sort of having just, genuinely just hugely beneficial implications and in terms of people power and democratization, although eventually I think the moment did sort of get absorbed in the practices of Western German politics. But the Berlin Wall, collapsed the Berlin Wall in 1989. And we have the quote here from Harald Jäger, who was the deputy director of the passport control unit in Bernholmer Strasse, November 9th, 1989. He says, "Normally you'd expect something to happen to you. I had refused to carry out, implement the orders." And of course he had. He was the commanding officer of this border checkpoint, and of course there were questions of what was going on at the time in the public mind, and he found one night that people were just turning up at his checkpoint because they'd heard a rumor that people were going to be let through at that checkpoint. He tried to call his superior officers to see what he should do. There was no response. more and more people were turning up, and suddenly, eventually, not that long later, thousands of people were queuing up outside the border checkpoint, and he was worried about people getting crushed in the crowd. So with his orders, he had orders to shoot, but if anyone had tried to cross, and if there was a sort of public control issues at the border checkpoint, but he couldn't obviously turn all these people away. So what does he end up doing? He ends up having to basically let the people through. He didn't want to follow his orders, and there was no response from his commanding superiors. So and people in Eastern Europe already knew a lot about power of the state. They had seen what happened in June 1953 in Berlin, and then later in Czechoslovakia in 1969. In autumn of 1989, many signs of protest were already coming across Eastern Europe. People were resisting state power. Large numbers had been turning up, 500,000 coming to the border in Eastern Berlin alone on November 4th, 1989. The USSR, under Premier Gorbachev, had said that they would not intervene, and so East Germany was kind of standing alone with this problem of what to do with the people who wanted to cross into West Germany. And already there had been leakage in the Soviet system because people were escaping via Hungary and Czech Republic from Germany. Anyway, so on November 9th, spontaneously, thousands of East Berliners arrived at the Bernholmer Strasse, as we've said, and this incident took place. So why do we obey? If we've just looked at the question of revolts sometimes being counterproductive, if we've just looked at the question of how revolts are sometimes very effective, and when the actual moment of revolution takes place, usually what happens is the authorities blink. If we've looked at those types of cases now, the question is, why do we obey, and why revolts don't happen all the time, for example. One of the great people we can turn to, we've already turned to him already this class for a variety of reasons, but one of the great people we can turn to for this is Max Weber, and he suggests that the answer changes depending on the time, right? That different human societies have different attitudes to order. And the reasons why people feel compelled to follow authority can vary from one type of order to another type of order. So Max Weber tells us, for example, that modern government is different to medieval government. How? Well, because medieval government believed in transcendent authority, it believed in God, it believed that power was vertically integrated in God's will. So the thing that gives us some sort of empirical demonstration of this is, of course, the era of Christendom, where the various nation states of Europe were aligned vertically under the will of the Vatican. It said that it was a form of international government, if you want to sort of think about a contemporary metaphor of what the Vatican might have sort of implied to people at that time. If the medieval government at the time believed in transcendent authority, then that contrasts with modern government, of course, where church and state are separated and you have no vertical integration. But that's not to say that religion and religious values completely disappear. One of the things that we say is sort of true about our own time, if we think about the philosopher Thomas Hobbes and his writings on the nature of modern sovereignty, and he of course was writing in the 17th century. He believed that in order for the nation state to hold together in an era where church and state were divided, that you'd have to come up with a kind of a temporal god, or a human god type figure, or a social god type figure that would replace the transcendent authority of the actual sort of religiously conceived God. And so Hobbes is one of the first people to struggle with this question, and of course he comes up with a kind of a scientific argument that says that, we can believe with the same conviction in the sovereign that we do with the religious conviction of believing in God. And so it's this idea of a translation from having a sort of religiously imagined God to a modernly, scientifically, imagined God in science, or in rationality rather, that I think Hobbes is sort of putting forward. And this idea of replacing the certainty of God with the certainty of science is not something that has been overlooked by scholars. They, for example, we have this quote from Talal Asad here: religion was considered to be an early human condition from which modern law, science, and politics emerged and became detached. But what Talal Asad is implying in his quote there is that, in fact, maybe that's not as true as we sometimes wish it was. That the conviction in modern law, science, and politics often is premised on faith and habit and conviction just as much as the old religious values were. So Max Weber was very interested in how this transition took place, this transition from the medieval religious period to the modern secular period, and he was interested in how this transition from the past to the future imagined or understood the necessity of values that were typically religious in nature when otherwise imagined. And he argued that the contemporary secular revolt really came out of and first became prevalent during the time of the emergence of the Protestant Reformation in the Dutch lowlands. And he argued that one of the things that was really prevalent in the Calvinist ideal, Calvinist religious system, was the ideal of duty. And of course, in identifying this, what Weber is actually saying is, though, that even though people might someday stop being Calvinist or stop being Protestant or stop being Catholic, that culturally those values still linger on. They still have a role to play in their lives and in the daily lives of people around them, in their culture and society. So we can talk about people who are culturally Catholic or culturally Calvinist, even though they're not necessarily following the chapter and verse of the religion. And so if continuation of respect for authority was a Protestant ethic, and Calvinism had taught the value of self-discipline and duty, then you can see where I'm going with this. Even though people might someday stop going to church, those values might live on. So what does Calvinism teach us about the nature of contemporary, of the transmission of religious values into contemporary society? Well, Calvinism, of course, teaching self-discipline and duty to God, is basically suggesting to people that it's kind of a sin in God's eyes for you to indulge yourself too much, right? To have too much stuff, to have too many flat screen televisions and too many diamond rings. The Calvinist attitude sort of turned its back on indulgence and having things, right, and luxury. So what Weber says is that this allowed Dutch Calvinists to accumulate tremendous amounts of savings because they were earning money, but they weren't spending it on anything. They were thrifty, right? So when Max Weber asks about the emergence of capitalism, the thing that he suggests is necessary is for those savings to be in place. So when Calvinism eventually fades, those values persist, and they are very useful values in terms of suggesting how there were initial reserves of capital available to people so that they could start practicing the art of being sort of kind of like corporate investors in investing in plant and building factories and employing people. And of course, that's the distinction, isn't it, that is always there between the workers and the owners. The owners are the ones that own the capital, and the workers are the ones that have to work in order to provide bread for their table. But for Weber, the important thing is that these values persist. And so this leads us to a very famous quote from Weber, and we see it at the bottom of the slide. The idea of duty in one's calling prowls about our lives like the ghost of dead religious beliefs. The idea of duty in one's calling prowls about our lives like the ghost of dead religious beliefs. I think it's a fantastic quote, and it implies a lot of what we've been talking about here. That the ghost of dead religious beliefs, the values of the Calvinists and the Protestants of the Dutch lowlands, still became fundamentally shaping values that allowed for the emergence of contemporary capitalism, and so. Even though we may not have any sort of obvious connection ourselves with Dutch Calvinists, we live in a society that's culturally very Calvinist, because capitalism itself requires Calvinistic values in order for it to be able to survive. So what? Well, why are we talking about authority in such detail? Like, what does it matter? Well, if Calvinism explains respect for modern authority, I guess the question then is, what kind of authority is it? Calvinism is all about loyalty, it's about duty, it's about saving money, it's about not indulging in spending on luxuries when you don't need it. But for what? So what do we call this? What does it all add up to be? Well, for Max Weber, the important term here is that we live in a legal, rational type of authority, right? It is a type of authority whereby the legitimacy of the power holder to give commands, as it says here in the quote, rests upon rules that are established rationally by enactment, by agreement, or by imposition. So another way of putting this is to say we live in a society run by experts. You and I and everyone else are very dutiful. On average in this society, we respect police officers and all the rest. We obey them. But more than that, let's remember the Stanley Milgram experiments. What did Stanley Milgram tell us about ourselves when we found ourselves going into that office to help electrocute these actors, right? What we found out is that we tend to respect and obey experts. We tend to respect and obey people with white lab coats who are telling us that this is all in the name of science. So I think you see that sort of in everyday life here in the Western world as well, because we're constantly listening to the radio and hearing day in, day out about what experts are saying is healthy for us or unhealthy for us. If you listen to the radio, one week they're telling you it's garlic, it's going to give you cancer. The next week they're telling you garlic is the best thing you can possibly have because it cleans the blood. So, who knows at the end of the day, but the reality is that we live in a very expert-driven society. So if we keep Max Weber in mind, he would have been telling us that once upon a time it would have been the priests and the kings who would have had the legitimacy as the decision makers, but now today it's the experts, the bureaucrats, the scientists, and it is this class of people in a way that, because they give us the cues that we modify our own lives by, they are the ones that really are the governors today. So think, maybe as a thought experiment yourself, as you're watching this lecture or after this lecture, try to ask yourself, how do experts shape your life? What decisions are government experts making that shape your life for you today? Has your life ever been affected by a government expert, or do you ever sort of tune into the television or listen to the radio and hear an expert tell you something's good or bad for your health, and change your life to be able to satisfy your sense that this is an important change that you need to make in order for you to be healthy? Another approach to understanding why people obey comes to us from Durkheim. Durkheim argues that society has its own specific nature, that it is different from our own nature as individuals. But because it can achieve those ends only by working through us, it categorically demands our cooperation. Society requires us to make ourselves its servants. It subjects us to all sorts of restraints, without which social life would be impossible. So what is Durkheim arguing here? He's arguing that we obey because we are sort of led by society to be its servants, right? Society needs to keep us in awe. So it's a kind of a different argument to Weber. Weber was going back to Protestantism and telling us that these sort of deep cultural values were very, very important and relevant if we wanted to understand why people were obedient. But Durkheim is arguing something a little bit different here. He's arguing that society itself, this thing called society, has a different nature to the nature of us as individuals. We as individuals, of course, can be charismatic and people can follow us, but the individuals can't achieve what the bigger society can achieve in terms of our understanding of who we are and what our potential is. So, for example, you think about this movie, I don't know, it's a great movie to watch actually if you've never watched it. It's called Into the Wild. And here it's a story about a young man who rejects human society and decides to go off and live by himself in Alaska in the wilderness. And he doesn't last very long, of course. He comes to a terrible end. He runs out of food. He finds that all the survival skills that he's learned and the years and years of training and preparation that he's undergone in order to be able to achieve this goal have left him completely unprepared for life in the wilderness, even though he thought he'd be able to manage it. And so this is kind of the mysticism of society. Once we watch this movie, we realize that, in fact, we cannot really survive without society. We cannot really get along without other human beings. We are fundamentally social creatures. We cannot do it on our own. We depend on society for our lives, basically. So in this sense, I think what Durkheim is doing is he's sort of suggesting or citing back to Hobbes, who we were talking about a moment ago, who suggests that the sovereign is the thing that exists in order for us to be able to continue with our lives. And it's this kind of, I guess, idea of a political logic or political rationale that for Durkheim keeps us going. So there is a contrast there with Weber. Weber giving us this kind of sort of religious background and argument that we're sort of trained culturally to be obedient. Durkheim coming along and saying something a bit different, that we're sort of hypnotized by society. We're in awe of society and the fact that really we know that we can't make it on our own without society. So we're kind of helpless in the face of the society that we're living in. We were just talking about Hobbes, and of course Hobbes is making a sort of he's further back historically than Durkheim, but you can see the same argument here. This is this classic argument from Hobbes about the state of nature, and of course we see the two cavemen here in the screen. And what are the cavemen representing? The cavemen are representing the fact that in Hobbes' imagination anyway, that human beings were kind of anarchic creatures before we had the modern government, before we had the modern state. And in the way Hobbes imagines life for cavemen is reflected in the quote here on the screen. He says that in the state of nature there's no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So this is a very sort of zero-sum game society, in Hobbes's version of anarchy, men are constantly at each other's throats, and if one man develops a way to make a bigger spear, then the other men are inherently insecure, and of course will have to set out ways to defend themselves or to maybe counterattack. But nothing is secure, your lunch, your dinner is not yours if you can't defend it, and so people have horrible, short, miserable lives. But I think a great question here is how accurate is Hobbes's explanation of of the state of nature. A lot of people would since then have challenged Hobbes on that and said that maybe human beings were not as argumentative or contrarian in anarchic society as Hobbes is making them out to be. But anyway, for Hobbes, one amazing thing that comes out of this, of course, for him is a very clear logic about what he calls the social contract. And in the social contract, you can see a lot of what Durkheim was talking about, the mysticism of the state, the sort of almost religion of the state in its own right. That for Hobbes, once upon a time, in this anarchical society, people kind of figured out that this was not a really positive way to proceed. So they communicated with each other their desire to leave this state of nature behind, to leave the anarchy behind, and they entered into a social contract where they gave their power to carry out violence to a common actor. And that common actor was going to be appointed the sovereign or the monarch or whatever you want to call it. The deal would be that they would give up their military power, right? The individuals, their power to be sort of equipped with armaments and to defend themselves, to this common power, which would take up that power and sort of create out of it a police force and a military and a government, which had one primary task but there were others. But the primary task is to defend people's lives and to provide a security system, a police system, so that people would not be at each other's throats all the time anymore. On this slide, and I'll move through this one very quickly, I just wanted to show it to you very briefly because it's the frontispiece, the front cover of the original edition of Hobbes's book, The Leviathan. And just look at the sort of cartoon bubble speech here. Hobbes is offering a criticism here of people who say that the state is divined by God. Some people say that order is God's will, but what Hobbes is saying is that in fact it is man-made, right? That what man is creating out of his own will is a kind of a common power, where once upon a time he just had the power of each individual, and the power of mankind was divided then. Now we have common power, and out of this common power, of course, we've created the nation state. And so look at the sort of figure that's emerging over the hill here and think about what Durkheim was saying, that we are in awe of the state. It's weird, but what Hobbes is sort of presenting us here is the image of a huge titanic figure emerging over these mountains. And of course it's a king of some sort, has a crozier in one hand, a sword in the other, and it seems to be wearing chainmail armor. But actually, if we look closely at this chainmail armor, we find that it's not chainmail armor at all. It's actually, if you can, I don't know if you can see it on your video, but if you get an image and you look it up on the internet, you can look close and you can see that this chainmail armor is actually made of people. In fact, it's not armor at all. It's the body made up of a multitude of bodies, and it's coming up over the horizon, sort of representing, if you will, this vertical integration of power, but also the spiritual dimension. The fact that the figure is holding a crozier means that it has a kind of a religious power, and not religion in the sense of a religion that you and I would sort of think of it in terms of a worshipping of a god or what have you, but this scepter, this crozier, or whatever you want to call it, is a symbol of religious power nonetheless. And it's this idea of a religion of the state, of a sort of a common culture of the state, that the Leviathan is going to be able to create once it comes into existence. And so Hobbes is really telling us a lot about how the nation state functions there, that it has this kind of power, even though it is an artificial man itself, that it has this power to sort of make us forget that the state is really our power embodied in a set of institutions that govern us. It's not really a figure. So Hobbes's image is highly, in a way, deceitful in a way, but it reveals much, because it's this moment, I guess, where this sort of deceit begins, but it's a deceit that's carried on ever since, that we thought we were creating something to give us protection and freedom, and then we forgot, of course, that once we'd done that it was still our power that had made it, right? Nevertheless, today we have this terrible habit of taking the state for granted. And that's part of our argument today, isn't it, really, that obedience comes from habits of thinking. And I'm not, of course, not for a minute arguing that the goal here is to preach revolution or sedition. I'm simply suggesting that one of the things that we're not good at as human beings is criticizing the terms upon which our political reality is presented to us. We think of the state as a real thing, but it's not a real thing. It's something that's made by us. It's a construction. It's an artificial thing. As we say here in the cartoon, the state is a man-made phenomena. So it's important to recognize that. So this is going to allow us maybe an opening here to start doing some rethinking of power. Hobbes' description of the state says we make it with our power, but we tend to forget that, right? So power is in a way very simple. It is something that we do possess, but we tend to forget we possess it, right? And I think that's possibly because we have a poor understanding of power, and we have a poor understanding of our relationship to power. I think people can possess power in the sense of power to change political institutions, but I guess there's also another kind of power, isn't there? There's the power of the people, but then there's the power that the people are constituted from, right? This power of the state, for example, this sort of semi-religious power of the state, can flow through the people and keep them mesmerized, keep their culture keep them culturally desensitized to notions of revolution and that kind of thing. So we want to ask where that kind of power comes from, what that kind of power suggests about politics. And it's not clear how we should proceed there. But one thing I want to sort of advise you about is the fact that the thinking about power in politics tends to split into two directions. One is the idea that people have the power, and so therefore the state is and not only that they have the power, but they're aware that they have the power and that they are rational about their power. And in that case, we believe that the state is a production of the people, who are sort of active citizens participating in elections and being very, very aware of what's going on, that they are engaged citizens. But oftentimes we know that people are not fully engaged, especially in democracies. One of the things that tends to happen or can happen is that people kind of become laid back, lazy, and uncaring. Although obviously we saw that in the Occupy protests, there was a way in which it emerged that maybe people were more politically motivated than we had given them credit for in recent times, and at least. But I wanted to talk to you about a group of scholars who are perhaps more tuned into the idea of the fact that obedience is a factor here. Because if all we do is we think about the fact that people are active citizens and actively participating in politics, I think we'll miss some of the ways that we were talking about earlier, that people tend to be sort of asleep at the wheel. Remember the Milgram experiments? I mean, those are clearly questions where people could be exercising powers of critical thought, to ask themselves, what am I doing here? Why am I causing this guy so much pain? That idea, that capacity for criticism is very important here. And so what we're going to try to do now, I think, is ask, why is it that people don't always exercise criticism? And one key figure here, I think, is Michel Foucault. Foucault wrote a lot about power, and in his key quote here, he has a notion he calls the repressive hypothesis, and he's criticizing this notion of the repressive hypothesis here. Now, Foucault, in this quote, this is part of a much longer story, and I'm just going to be very, very brief here because we're running out of time. But one of the things that Foucault is asking us to think about is, maybe in distinction to, say, a Freudian or a Marxist who, I don't know if you know much about Freud or if you don't know much about Marx, but both of those thinkers tended to think of power as being something over us, right? Almost like the way Hobbes's cartoon image of the Leviathan was coming up over the mountain, it was lording it over us like a figure of authority, right? That power is vertically integrated and power looms down on us from on high. I think that's Hobbes's message, and Marx in a way internalizes that idea when he talks about his battle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And if you want to look those terms up, if you don't understand them, or come to me, I can explain them to you. Similarly, Freud, though, if you want to understand the model of vertical integration of power, you could think about Freud talking about the Oedipal complex and the fact that the power of the father figure to prohibit the infant's sexual desires is absolute. And so consequently for Freud, we spend the rest of our lives as human beings living out the internalization of the will of the father figure to renounce our pleasures, to renounce our own internal desires. And so both for Marx and for Freud, there's this idea of a power over us that is exerting an intellectual and cultural influence on us, that's making us think thoughts that are not in our natural self-interests, right? So for Marx, why aren't the poor people rising up to overthrow this evil thing called capitalism? Well, because they're brainwashed effectively by the bourgeoisie. Similarly for Freud, we are brainwashed by paternalism, by this force called paternalism, if you will, to constrain, to control our emotions and our impulses. But Foucault rejects this thinking, right? Because he's kind of concerned that if we think about power, if we only ever think about power that's sort of over us or on top of us, we lose part of the picture, we lose part of the story. That power for Foucault then is often something that is not over us, but power maybe is among us, right? And so when we said in the last slide that people have the power, I think Foucault has an interesting question for us. Sure, maybe the people have the power, but they don't always know they have the power. And I think one of the reasons they don't know they have the power is because they think the power is up there, right? So this is Foucault's point about the repressive hypothesis, right? That we sometimes sort of focus far too much on the idea of the state as being something over us that can repress us. But he says here that if we define the effects of power as repression, then what we're really saying is that power is the law, and the law a law that says no, effectively, right? And that we get in the habit of thinking of the law as something that says no, like you don't pick your nose, or you must drive the car with a seatbelt, you must not drive over 70 miles an hour on the highway, or something like this, So power is power that says what your limits are. And then he says power is taken above all as carrying the force of a prohibition. But, right, do you really think one would be able to obey it? What makes power hold good is that it doesn't only weigh on us as a force which says no, but that it traverses and produces things. It induces pleasure. So I think for Foucault, the people have the power, right? But what he's saying here is that most of the time, it seems the people think that the power is not with them, but it's over them in this thing called the state. But Foucault is saying that perhaps the power of that state doesn't really exist. Instead, what we really have is a fantasy of the state, or a script, if you will, of a play. If you think of it, the script for a play, maybe we read it a long time ago and we memorized the lines, and we started acting it out, but then we forgot that it was just a script, right? And I think that's exactly what Foucault's talking about here, is the kind of idea that we're all playing a role in a play that we've forgotten is a play. And so why do we do it? Is it because there's a power over us or a force over us that's saying we must, or that's prohibiting us from ever breaking our boundaries? No, it's because we have the power and we forgot we had the power, right? We take pleasure in what we do, right? We love it. We love to be part of the order of things. We love to be part of the system. It gives us tremendous pleasure, and it's because we find such pleasure in it that we forget that it's just theater, that it's just a play. And you might say, well, that sounds very nice, but of course people end up suffering tremendously in that, right? If the extreme example of that is the Holocaust, and the Eichmann effect, and this is what, of course, Hannah Arendt was talking about and what Milgram's experiments were based on. But even in our own times, we think about the anti-Vietnam protests, we think about the Kent state shootings, and we think about the huge police force and brutality that's been used against the people in the Occupy Wall Street phenomena. We think about the fact that the police, for example, seem to incarcerate so many people in America. The highest percentage of the population of any country on earth is incarcerated in the United States of America. So, it's not like things are that much better now than they were then. That there is a lot of police force used against the American population. And it maybe is a problem. Maybe it is a problem that people don't wake up a little bit more from the theater of their lives and realize that the state and the police force that the state has doesn't necessarily have to exist the way it exists, that it could be different. If people wanted it to be different, they could use their power differently. Foucault talks about cutting off the king's head, and it's a kind of a metaphor here. But the question here is, why do we respect the state so much? And why do we get such pleasure from being part of the state? And, in Hobbes's time, the king's head was literally chopped off. And then also later in the French Revolution, the king's head was literally chopped off. But the question Foucault raises is that despite the fact that we no longer really live in an era of monarchical sovereignty, we still kind of act it out that we do, right? We're used to the script of the play. We've forgotten that we're on a stage. We've forgotten that we're part of a play. And we keep acting it out as if it's real. Even though we cut the king's head off in our understanding of, even though we cut the king's head off in a literal political sense, we have failed singularly to cut the king's head off in our theorizing and in the way we imagine the state and the way we understand the state. So today, although we have no literal king, we still think of the state in Hobbesian terms as a Leviathan coming up over the mountain with power over us. And Foucault is really convinced that this is actually a huge part of the problem, that we believe in the reality of the state, that we believe that we have to take the teachings and the lecturings and the strictures of the state seriously, as if it's some sort of expert power or autonomous power to us. And what he's suggesting is that, actually it's just not true, right? That the state isn't real. It exists only in our heads. And the Milgram experiments, of course, prove this. So, and if we don't think that this is true, by the way, we can find counterpositive examples. So it's so ordinary for us today to think we live in a state, but if you go to back to our lectures where we talked about the Kalahari Bushmen and the nomadic peoples of the Kalahari Desert, for them as nomadic peoples, living in a state is not, it does not go without saying that we all live in a state. For them, living in a state is not second nature. So, that's a huge point. Not everyone lives the way we live, and not everyone wants to live the way we live. So we got to keep that point in mind. And so the final slide of this lecture, I just want to hit this one very, very briefly because it'll be useful for the exam. We're talking about the Holein the Flag, and the image here is more important than the name of the book. But the question is, if this flag represents an image of the Romanian Revolution of 1989, what was going on in Romania that the citizens wanted to cut a hole in the flag of Romania? Of course, there was a symbol there originally, and they didn't like the symbol and they cut it out. But then, of course, we can ask questions about what the flag might mean, And so the philosopher, he's currently, he's a living philosopher, he's a contemporary philosopher, Slavoj Žižek. He asks the question, well, maybe we should think about the meaning of this hole in a flag. What does it mean to have a hole in a flag? And what I think Žižek is trying to draw our attention to is the idea that there's when we think we're obeying authority, really what we're doing is we're just respecting symbols. All we're really doing is acknowledging our respect for the symbols of political power. But those symbols are empty, they're arbitrary, and there's not really anything there. It's just a gesture, or it's just a piece of text, or it's just an image. It doesn't actually really mean anything. We can also think about Hobbes's image. The head of the Leviathan why is that also not made of the people? Why does Hobbes separate the image out, so it's just that the body is made up of all the people, the multitude, and then the head seems to be sort of its own one solitary actor. And of course that's the illusion, right? That the head that the state has one mind, or it acts as one entity. That there is a thing called the United States, or there is a thing called the Republic of Ireland, and it acts as one actor, or acts as one thing. It's we often talk about, Ireland has said this, or Australia has said that. The Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, speaks and issues the perspective of America vis-a-vis America's foreign policy. But of course that's not true, right? I mean, the Secretary of State doesn't speak for America. She is merely a symbol. She's merely a relay point for a vastly complex bureaucratic enterprise, which is the United States government in DC, and it itself is constituted and founded in people who are drawn from the general population. So there's a huge complexity there, and I think what the Holein the Flag is intended to sort of represent is that these people were suggesting that the game was up, that they weren't willing to respect the symbols of the state anymore. They weren't willing to say that the state was only one entity with one voice, and that they were not prepared to accept the illusion anymore. So the whole represents that they've seen through the illusion of the state. They were saying they did not want to be disciplined by this illusion anymore, that they realized that in fact at the end of the day they were the ones with the power, and they were taking their power back. So in summation, our final question really is whether there is any such thing as the state, or is it just the way we behave when we forget there is a hole in the flag? And doesn't every country really have a flag with a hole? Aren't all flags holy? And actually it's a nice play on words. If we think about going back to Weber and the idea of a spirituality, and Durkheim and the idea of us being in awe of the state, both of these theorists sort of via different routes giving us idea of a sort of a religious or sacred notion of the state. So their flags are of course holy in a HOLY sense, but they're also holy as in they're full of holes. And once you can see that, it's very hard to not see it, of course. Once you've seen through that we cut the head off the king, as Foucault says, in both senses, then it's hard to see the state the same way ever again, I think. So that's it, folks. That's the end of this week's lecture, and I hope you enjoy it, and I will look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Take care. Bye-bye.